For the first time, I decided that I would print out my script. I feel like one of those old-timey newsreaders before they had like the prompters. And much like a newsreader, I too am not wearing pants. Oh god. Let's start by asking a question. Do people have a right to reproduce and to have as many kids as they want? A person's answer to this question can say a lot about their personal views, their cultural background, their religious beliefs, as well as their generational mindset. Many people born around the beginning of the 21st century, myself included, are quite disillusioned with what humans have accomplished over several millennia of civilization. Also, I never see myself having like $500,000 lying about that I can just spend on a child. If I had that kind of money, I'd probably just buy myself a fancy coffee maker. But anyways, I also think it's quite risky to ask people whether they believe in the right to reproduce. I think it's very easy to begin by making good faith arguments that are either antinatalist or pronatalist, but by taking those arguments to their logical extreme, you could end up with notions that devalue human lives, particularly the lives of people who are already marginalized, such as people who are poor and especially, I think, people who are disabled. In the late 1970s and the 1980s, China took antinatalism to its logical extreme, greatly limiting the number of children a family could have and sometimes using coercive means to enforce childbearing quotas. While for some, the one-child policy has become a symbol of the communist regime's oppression of its own people, others, perhaps frightened by the apocalyptic prognostications of a world drowning in people, viewed China's birth program as a necessary evil. But the reason I find the one-child policy so interesting is that it probably represents the most ambitious effort by any government to engineer its population to achieve radical economic advancements in a short period of time, and to simultaneously change the childbearing habits of nearly 1 million people, whether that was by education, persuasion, or coercion. And even though the one-child policy came to an end nearly 10 years ago, I think looking back at what was going on in China between 1979 and 2015 can be very informative to contemporary debates, especially with the growing threat of states depriving women of their reproductive freedoms and bodily autonomy in some places. So in this video, we're not just going to be talking about the logic behind China's policy, but the broader context of the Communist Party's birth planning program. We're also going to be talking about women's health in the early 20th century, which was when China was controlled by the Nationalist Party or the Kuomintang, and how rising nationalism created new notions of women's childbearing and child-rearing responsibilities. I think it's also important to look at this period of time because a lot of the trends and the attitudes towards childbirth and birth control that emerged in these decades continued into the communist era. As we will see, despite paying lip service to women's liberation and gender equality, the Communist Party's program in fact placed a significant burden on women's bodies to achieve drastic reductions in birth rates. While childbearing age women bore the brunt of sterilization and contraception, millions of infant girls were simply abandoned or put to death. However, I don't just want to talk about the negative consequences of the one-child policy. While doing my research, I was truly impressed by the resilience of the people, especially in rural areas, and the ways in which they resisted the demands placed upon them by the Beijing bigwigs and local party workers. The reason I think it's important to talk about the peasants is because in holding steadfastly to their traditional ideas about the social and cultural significance of children, they represented a significant ideological opposition to the state's antinatalist views. And while the rural population might not have had the political clout to derail the government's plans, they still offered enough resistance to lead the CCP to reconsider aspects of the one-child policy in the 1980s and 1990s. So before we get into the video, say it with me. All sources are linked down below in proper MLA citation, along with the link containing all the image credits. Don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss the next part of the series where we talk about women's reproductive health in 20th 20th century America, and how capitalism and industrialism shaped attitudes towards things like periods, pregnancy, and contraception. We also have some really interesting videos coming up about menstruation in Africa and Latin America. So now let's begin with talking about reproduction in the decades before the Communist Party's rise to power, so that we can get a broader understanding of how notions of womanhood especially were changing in the early 20th century. China in the early 20th century was still very much figuring out what it wanted to be. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled the nation since the 17th century, came to an end in 1911 with the abdication of the 6-year-old emperor Pu Yi. Just imagine trying to live that down for the rest of your life. Now, on the one hand, there was a keen sense of China's economic, political, and technological inferiority to the West and even to Japan, leading some commentators to dub the nation the sick man of Asia. Some thinkers and reformers believed that the country needed to modernize itself by breaking free of traditional Confucian values and emulating the West. Yet at the same time, there was also a deep sense of distrust and resentment towards Westerners, whose presence on the Chinese mainland had been increasing since the Opium Wars. And these sentiments found their expression in violent uprisings like the Boxer Rebellion in North China, when foreigners, Christian missionaries, and Chinese Christians were killed in a war that aimed to rid China of foreign presence. However, eventually there was a growing conviction that the country needed to modernize to rehabilitate itself in the aftermath of the Qing downfall. The humiliating defeats China had faced during the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese Wars evinced the urgent need for health reforms to improve the country's physical standards. These concerns were fueled by ideas like Darwinism and eugenics that were filtering in from the West, spurring debates about the relationship between human reproduction and the population body. For several reformers, health began at home. A change in the position of women was seen as key to altering the health of the nation, and these beliefs culminated in the creation of a new archetypical form of femininity, the new woman. The new woman was educated, savvy, and sophisticated. She worked outside the home, but only on jobs that were appropriate for women. Her feet were not bound. She wore functional, comfortable, Western-style clothing, and she married at a comparatively more mature age to a man of her choosing. As in Japan, I think there was a certain glamour associated with the new woman or the modern woman, but at the same time, these new women did not challenge the gender dynamics within the house. New women were still expected to fulfill the role of good wives and wise mothers and prove their devotion to the nation by fulfilling domestic, conjugal, and reproductive duties. So what exactly did the new woman have to do with the nation's health? So on the one hand, it was believed that her education would aid her in creating conditions within the home that were conducive to raising healthy and intelligent children. She would also raise the next generation of Chinese to be free of superstition and backward thinking. With the growing discourse surrounding eugenics, it was believed that a woman with positive characteristics could directly pass these down to her children. Debates about birth control became more prominent in China in the 1920s and 1930s, and were often closely related to concerns about improving the genetic makeup of the population. In 1922, the birth control advocate Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, visited China. Sanger is today celebrated as the founder of the birth control movement, but her advocacy was actually very closely tied to her beliefs about the benefit of ensuring that poor and unfit people refrain from reproducing. Her visit to Asia and the talks she delivered sparked a larger conversation within the Chinese newspapers about the need for birth control and its use in improving the quality of China's people. Sarah Mellers Rodriguez points out that ideas about biological determinism were in a sense not new to China, but Margaret Sanger's ideas perhaps reassured people that eugenicist beliefs were modern and that its principles were worth implementing in China. Indeed, the sexologists Ye Duwei and Zhang Jingsheng were convinced that eugenics would allow the Chinese people to produce a new nation inhabited by a stronger and more intelligent Chinese Chinese race more able to defend itself against foreign power. Now, birth control is often viewed as an integral part of women's liberation. However, it's important to note that Chinese reformers and intellectuals at the time didn't view contraception as a way for women to decide whether or not they wanted to have children. Women were still very much expected to be mothers. People who held eugenicist views saw birth control as a way of improving the quality of China's people, both physically and mentally, and perhaps limiting family sizes towards that end, so that you'd have a smaller quantity of quality children instead of a large quantity of poor quality children. So for this reason, the growing popularity of birth control during this period of time went hand in hand with the increased expectation that women birth strong, able-bodied, ideally male offspring. Additionally, as in most societies, the responsibility for birth control fell almost entirely on women. Condoms were not very widely used when they were first introduced, especially because they were made of very stiff rubber. But even when latex condoms became more widely available, many men refused to use them because they claimed that they reduced sexual pleasure. Go figure. As we will see in later sections, women would continue to bear an unequal burden for birth control throughout the 20th century. And later on, they were far more likely to be the targets of state-sanctioned sterilization than men. And this proves how birth control wasn't so much about liberating Chinese women or granting them freedoms. It was more a means to enlist them and their bodies into the cause of first improving the health of the population and then limiting the size of the population. I find the archetype of the new woman extremely interesting, especially because it's one that we encounter in many different places under many different names at the beginning of the 20th century. Over the past few videos, we saw that such new women drove tractors and worked in factories in the Soviet Union and played an active role in reducing the number of infanticides in Japan. In the US, the 1930s saw the rise of career women, who were predominantly white women who started working outside of the home. And in my opinion, the rise of nationalism actually had an important role in ushering these women into new occupations. Their participation in the labor force was justified in terms of the national good that this would bring, whether that meant an increase in economic development, improvements in public health, or a boost to industrial production during the wars. Similarly, in China, new women were not limited to birthing and raising the next generation of kids. Rising rates of female literacy coincided with growing opportunities for education and employment specifically for women. Midwifery was one of the jobs that new women could take up. Within China at the time, it was considered a traditionally female occupation that was actually quite low status because of its association with blood and filth and pollution. But in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, doctors and health reformers aimed to radically transform the profession by making science rather than religious belief its guiding principle, and they plan to do so by training a new generation of new, younger midwives who would be educated in medical science at professional schools and institutions. One of the greatest contributors to the modernization of midwifery in China was Yang Chongrui, an obstetrician educated first at the Peking Union Medical College and then at Johns Hopkins University in America. In 1921, the National Midwifery Board, which was chaired by Yang, passed a resolution to establish the first national midwifery school, which would be associated with the PUMC and funded by the Chinese Ministry of Health as well as the Rockefeller Institution. Also, as a side note, many foreign missionaries, charitable organizations, and universities played a pretty important role in helping establish a public health program in China at this time. In this case, I think the collaboration between the Nationalist government and the Rockefeller Foundation, an organization that's now infamous for its pro-eugenicist stance in the 20th century, shows how deeply mired China's public health program was in ideas of Western science and birth control. The aim of the first national midwifery school was twofold. Firstly, it aimed to provide a rigorous education to younger women who had graduated either middle school or or high school in scientific and hygienic methods of delivering babies. These new midwives were called zuchanshi, which literally translates to birth assistant or birth helper, with the suffix shi signifying their educated status. However, it was recognized that it would take a considerable amount of time to not just train enough zuchanshi to cater to the entire population, but to get people to accept these new birth helpers as opposed to traditional midwives. For this reason, the second aim of the school was to re-educate the traditional midwives themselves. These older women were called jishengpo, a title that roughly translates to birth receiver and signifies the older age of these women. Jishengpo were typically older, uneducated women who had learned their trade from even older traditional midwives, but more importantly, they were often women who had experienced childbirth themselves, which perhaps in the eyes of the average people gave them a competitive advantage over the zuchanshi. The first national midwifery school aimed to educate these traditional midwives in simple hygiene procedures that would drastically reduce the number of infant and maternal deaths. At the time, most mothers' lives during childbirth were claimed by puerperal sepsis or childbed fever, which is an infection of the reproductive tract following the delivery of the baby. The babies, on the other hand, were most likely to suffer from neonatal tetanus, a form of tetanus that newborns can acquire when their umbilical cord is cut. Also, at the time, it was common for traditional midwives to smear the umbilical cord with mud or dung before cutting it, so it probably isn't surprising that a lot of babies got tetanus. The first national midwifery school was modestly successful in spreading obstetrical care to women throughout China. It was assumed that midwives who graduated the longer course at the school would in turn train other women through shorter courses. Additionally, the school itself provided supplemental training to lots of graduates from other local midwifery schools. The goal of the institution was therefore not just to provide a highly specialized education to a small number of students, but to generally spread ideas about childbirth, health, and hygiene to healthcare providers across the country, regardless of whether they were jishengpo or graduates from other schools. In doing so, the FNMS also sought to enhance the status of midwifery as a worthy and respectable profession for intelligent young women who were making an important contribution to the nation's health. As Tina Phillips Johnson points out in her book, Childbirth in Republican China, the efforts of the first national midwifery school were one of the first instances of the government's interference in people's private reproductive lives, because the school was, after all, funded by the Ministry of Health. This interference was considered necessary to modernize the nation by reducing the numbers of preventable deaths. And I absolutely do not mean to suggest that the efforts of Yang Changrui or the FNMS were not genuinely beneficial to women. But similar to the new midwives we encountered in the last video about Japan, new midwives in China helped carry the mission of national improvement into the homes of the average people. In other words, the zuchanshi and to a lesser extent the jishengpo helped bring people into the state's fold, transforming childbirth from a private familial cultural event into a national concern that had to be regulated, registered, and controlled. And as we will see in later sections, many of the reproductive values and principles that emerged at this time would continue to define the state's control of childbirth even after the CCP's rise to power. In 1945, China was plunged into a civil war between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. As the CCP gradually gained control of the Chinese mainland, many institutions that once depended on the support of the nationalist government were forced to disband. Among these was the first national midwifery school. The CCP's rise to power and the subsequent establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 sparked a wider conversation about childbirth, birth control, and the need to limit the population. Several histories of the one-child policy take this period as their starting point, a time when it seemed the government couldn't make up its mind about whether or not to encourage people to limit their family size. China's closest international ally in the 1950s was, of course, the Soviet Union. You might have encountered the several very gay propaganda posters that were printed during this time. And as we saw in an earlier video, the USSR under Stalin advocated a pro-natalist stance during and immediately after the Second World War, in part to make up for the millions of lives that had been lost. China followed suit, and as in the Soviet Union, women who bore many children during the early communist period were also honored as glory mothers. That just sounds wrong. I know it's a literal translation, but it sounds wrong. However, at the same time, there was a recognition of the need to increase access to abortion and contraception. Abortion had been illegal in China for the first half of the 20th century, except for therapeutic reasons where the pregnancy posed a risk to the woman's life. But in 1953, the central government instructed local governments to increase access to abortions and sterilizations. The same year, Beijing began allowing women who were over the age of 35 and born at least 6 children to undergo abortions or sterilizations, but only with the consent of their husbands. The CCP's reluctance to committing itself to a systematic plan to reduce or limit the population also had an ideological reason. So with the end of the Second World War, many countries in Asia and Africa began gaining independence, and intellectuals in the West began sounding the alarm about the threat of population growth in these third world countries. Such fears trace their origin to an English economist called Thomas Robert Malthus and his 1798 book, An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus basically argued that as food production increases, populations also had a tendency to increase until they reached a point of war, disease, or famine. It followed that every region had a population carrying capacity, a fixed number of people that it was able to feed and whose needs it was able to meet. If the population grows beyond this carrying capacity, then the lower classes especially begin to face hardship and the threat of conflict arises. However, Chinese leaders, including Mao Zedong himself, opposed Malthusian theories and criticized them for being bourgeois and capitalist. Under Marxist theory, which was the main theory of the Communist Party, population is viewed as an asset because a larger population meant more workers, which meant more production, which meant more food, clothes, etc. for everyone. According to many communist thinkers within China at the time, Malthus's ideas were only relevant in a capitalist society, where wealth was unequally distributed and a small number of people owned the nation's resources and the means of production. But if the state intervened to ensure that everyone's needs were met, then theoretically, that's an important qualifier, no one would suffer. In her book, Just One Child, Science and Policy in Deng's China, Susan Greenhalgh argues that Malthusianism was considered an ideological crime in the early years of communist China. She claims that Mao Zedong's own pro-natalist stance was in part to blame for the failure to develop birth control programs in the 1950s and 1960s. While occasionally paying lip service to the need to limit the size of the population, Greenhalgh claims that Mao's initial and belligerent hostility to population restriction created a climate of uncertainty and fear around an already delicate matter, making it extremely difficult for supporters of population control to secure a fixed place on the nation's agenda. Such was Mao's influence not just within the Communist Party, but the whole of China, that there was a genuine fear among intellectuals, policymakers, and party members to go against what he had said. When an economist by the name of Ma Yinqiu concluded in 1957 that China's population growth rate would be detrimental to the country's development, he was publicly criticized for his supposedly Malthusian ideas. Therefore, nobody could do anything to limit or control the size of the population until after Mao's death. However, not everyone agrees with Greenhalgh's interpretation of Mao's role in blocking population control. That rhyme was unintentional. In her book, China's Longest Campaign, Birth Planning in the People's Republic 1949 to 2005, Tyreen White argues that Mao was in fact supportive of family planning measures. In a 1957 speech, which was the same year that Ma Ying-jeou was publicly humiliated, Mao apparently said the following: "With respect to births, mankind is in a state of anarchy. The self is unable to control the self. In the future, we want to achieve the complete planning of births, but without a societal strength, unless everyone agrees, unless everyone does it together, this won't work." What's crucial to understand here is that Mao wasn't advocating for a reduction in the population per se. Instead, he was calling for a planned increase in China's population, an increase that would be proportional to the country's economic growth and prosperity. White writes that in Mao's view, human reproduction, like economic production, could and should be organized rationally through state intervention and administration. Childbearing, like grain production, should and could be regulated according to state need and state plan. So to summarize, Susan Greenhalgh, on the one hand, argues that Mao was completely and utterly against any kind of birth control to limit the size of the population. Tyreen White, on the other hand, argues that Mao wasn't against family planning, but he also wasn't against the idea of China's population growing. He just thought that the population should grow in a manner that was planned by the state. So this brings us to the idea of family planning itself, and how the family planning that did manage to emerge in China in the 1950s and 1960s is far removed from our mostly Western liberal understanding of family planning today. Along with increasing access to abortions and sterilizations in 1953, in 1954 the government reversed a ban on the import of contraceptives, partly because China wasn't yet able to produce enough condoms on its own, and so it was actually quite common for people to just wash and reuse condoms. Additionally, women could go to local hospitals or clinics to get guidance on family planning matters, and they could buy contraception like condoms, diaphragms, and spermicidal jellies from pharmacies without a doctor's prescription. Note how it was the women at whom efforts to increase the use of contraception were initially targeted. But from the start, family planning in China was very different from what something like Planned Parenthood does today, or at least tries to do. In the words of Tyreen White, the Chinese notion of Jihua Shengyu, or birth planning, implies a subjection of childbearing to the state's machinery of economic planning. In other words, unlike the liberal notion of family planning, which suggests individual childbearing age couples making a personal decision of whether or not to have children, and if so, how many and at what time, Jihua Shengyu involved the state's active involvement in planning births. So even before the introduction of the one-child policy, the Chinese state was very much interested in inserting itself into people's reproductive lives. But despite increasing access to contraceptions, abortions, and sterilizations, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the state still didn't have a concrete policy to limit and control the number of births. As Susan Greenhalgh points out, for the first couple of decades of the PRC, that is from 1949 to 1959 to 1969, the population was growing by approximately 135 million. And events of the late 1950s and 1960s also diverted attention away from any sustained efforts at controlling births. The first of these was the Great Leap Forward, a campaign launched by Mao in 1957 that aimed to mobilize China's large population to dramatically increase grain production and industrialize rapidly. Part of the program involved the collectivization of agriculture in the countryside, with grain quotas to encourage peasants to grow more food. Mao, for one, seemed quite optimistic going into the campaign, and he was so positive about the growth that China would achieve in a few short years that he claimed it wouldn't be a bad thing if the population touched 800 million. But unfortunately, the Great Leap Forward ended up being a great disaster. Agricultural collectivization did not produce a drastic increase in food production, and the grain quotas might have actually meant that the peasants didn't have enough food to feed themselves. This resulted in one of the worst, if not the worst, famine in human history, with the number of deaths estimated to be between 30 and 45 million. This caused the CCP to dial back the program in 1960, but Mao still refused to listen to any sort of criticism of the Great Leap Forward and instead threw his denouncers into jail. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, there was a steep increase in births, which some writers attribute to the need to make up for lost lives. I think this makes sense when you consider that most people who died in the famine were probably young children and infants, and so of course people would be trying to have more children. But either way, Mao still wasn't done causing chaos, and his cult of personality was going strong. In 1966, he announced the Cultural Revolution, a sudden and violent movement to rid the state bureaucracy and society at large of corruption and capitalism, and to protect Chinese socialism. Millions of young people took up Mao's call to arms and joined the Red Army, while others were sent to the countryside to live and work among the peasants. Amidst all this chaos and violence, it probably wasn't the best time to do any kind of birth planning work. Besides, Sarah Mellers Rodriguez points out that in the fraught environment of the Cultural Revolution, any act or idea perceived as running counter to Mao's policies, including birth control and abortion at times, could result in punishment. Although concerns about economic development and food shortages had generated high-level endorsement of birth planning in the early 1960s, in reality, birth control and abortion continued to be perceived as politically suspect among some members of the rural population. So a variety of factors, from optimism about China's economic development to political upheaval, stood in the way of an actual birth planning program. What's also interesting is that conversations at the time about contraception and birth planning seldom mentioned the benefits of these in and of themselves. How they could, for example, protect women's reproductive health and well-being, as well as increase their participation in the labor force. To be sure, there were organizations like the All China Women's Federation, which along with female party cadres advocated for increased access to birth control in order to empower and liberate women. However, for the most part, issues of population growth, control, and limitation revolved around the economic and political implications of a large population. And as we will see in the next section, this blindness to how policy affects women would continue into the 1970s, and would result in a birth planning program that would severely affect both the health and the lives of women and girls across the country. The one-child policy. Now, despite seeming like a straightforward program, the one-child policy can be quite difficult to wrap our heads around. Who exactly was responsible for it? How was it tied to Mao's legacy? What were the historical and political events that led China's top leaders to sign off on it? These are all questions that we'll get to shortly, but let's begin with the discussion of the broader context in which the policy emerged in the 1970s. By 1971, it seemed as though China could no longer ignore the size of its population and the need to limit it. While the available population statistics were a bit iffy, it became clear that China was approaching 1 billion people by the end of the decade. Accordingly, the 5-year plans for 1971 to 1975 and then 1976 to 1980 included plans to reduce China's population growth to below a certain level. The latter set the targeted birth rate at 10 per thousand, or 10 babies born for every 1,000 people. But setting goals wasn't enough. To reduce birth rates, it was necessary to fundamentally change the childbearing habits and cultures of the masses. With this in mind, the state introduced the Later, Longer, Fewer guideline in 1971. This guideline encouraged people to get married later in life, at age 23 for women and age 25 for men, to start having children later in life, and to increase the spacing between births. This non-coercive go-slow policy was actually a remarkable success if we look at the raw data for the entire country. The crude birth rate, or the number of babies born per 1,000 people, fell from 30.7 to 19.3, and the total fertility rate, or number of children born per woman, fell from just under 6 to under 3. Susan Greenhalgh points out that the success of this policy is attributable to the fact that it was developed in close consultation with the very people whom it would affect, which is the peasants and rural people. The result was an indigenous Chinese policy that fit the realities of peasant life. She continues, "The policy took account of the needs of the peasantry, working them into a moderate and flexible set of rules that was acceptable to the rural majority. Instead of riding roughshod over peasant culture, the policy sought to temporarily accommodate village values while slowly modernizing them through propaganda and education." However, many leaders of the time believed that the accomplishments of the later longer fewer policy were not enough. In the 1970s, the fears of population increase that had been steadily growing since World War II reached a fever pitch, with some Western scientists and demographers predicting a doomsday scenario of a world covered with people without enough food, water, and resources. Inspired in part by Malthusian thinking, works like The Population Bomb by Paul R. Ehrlich and the Club of Rome report Limits to Growth contributed to concerns about population in the West. And as the conversation about economic growth, environmentalism, and the population became more alarmist, it was difficult for even China to ignore calls to limit its number of people. Now you might be wondering, if China under Mao was so anti-Malthusianism, then why was it listening to thinkers and writings that seemed to stem from a fundamentally Malthusian assumption that there's a limit to how much growth an environment can sustain? Well, firstly, Mao died in 1976 and unfortunately couldn't continue calling the shots from beyond the grave. Like, if that were possible, I fully expect that he would have done it. But anyways, after Mao was no longer in the picture, Deng Xiaoping assumed paramount leadership in 1979 and was committed to reforming China's economic and political system. Among his goals was achieving the four modernizations in the fields of agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. Later, Deng also hoped that the country's gross national product per capita, which is basically the value of goods produced per capita, would increase to $1,000 by the year 2000. The one-child policy seems to have stemmed from the idea that reducing the population was necessary to achieve economic development and prosperity instead of the other way around. But that was not the only reason why China's leaders green-lighted the program. In Susan Greenhalgh's opinion, the policy proved the true extent of the scientism that had taken hold of decision-makers at the time. Scientism refers to an excessive belief in the ability of science to make sense of the world and to reveal the truth. In the context of 1970s and 1980s Chinese policy, such scientism was reflected in the idea that Western science and technology alone could help the nation solve its problems and deliver it to modernity by the 21st century. And if you think back to the first section of this video, such scientism was also prevalent in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. When under the Nationalist government, it was believed that Western medical science held the key to China's modernization. Greenhalgh even goes so far as to say that, to its makers in China, the one-child policy is not about a strong state or its coercive practices. It is about Western science. More specifically, it is about the nation's dreams for transforming a poor, downtrodden nation into a prosperous, modern, global power through selective absorption of Western science and technology. One of the chief architects of the program was Song Jian, a military scientist who studied missile systems. In the 1970s, he drew upon cybernetics and control theory, which are two things that I, unfortunately, am too dumb to understand and so cannot explain to you, to create a computer model that he claimed calculated the precise increase of China's population in the next couple of decades. Now, Song's work was super complicated and super fancy, and according to Greenhalgh at least, very few people actually understood the math behind it. But they were so fascinated by the science behind his projections that they didn't question it. For example, Song convinced people of the importance of his work by using this handy-dandy little graph that shows the rate at which China's population would grow given different total fertility rates, or TFR. And as you can see, if the average number of children born to every woman was about 1 to 1.5, then the population was projected to peak at around 1 billion and then decline to around 500 million and 700 million respectively. But at a rate of 3 children per woman, which was roughly the TFR in the 1970s, the population was expected to rise steeply to over 4.5 billion by 2080 with no decline in sight. This simple graph stoked fears of the severe overpopulation that would face China if drastic measures weren't taken immediately. Song's projection made it look as though not only China's economic development, but its very survival was at stake in the race to modernize and reduce the number of Chinese. Except Song's math had one fatal flaw. By placing all their eggs in the science basket, as it were, Song and his team failed to account for how sociological factors shape childbearing habits. This number of 4.6 billion Chinese by 2080 was based on the assumption that there would be no social change over the next 100 years, whether that be in patterns of urbanization or in the rising rates of education and employment for women. And, perhaps this number was supposed to be more theoretical than real. Perhaps it was simply meant to play into alarmist fears to get people to accept Song's findings. But even if that were the case, then it speaks to the disregard that Song and his hard science buddies had for not just the social sciences, to which policymakers paid almost no attention while drafting the one-child policy, but for the role of humans as active agents in the creation of their future. Now, it's important to remember that Chinese politics at the highest level is clouded in an air of secrecy. I mean, all politics at the highest level is clouded in an air of secrecy, but Chinese politics more so. And this often leaves researchers making some educated guesses, which in turn leads them to differing interpretations of how and why the one-child policy was adopted. So as we've already seen, Susan Greenhalgh argues that the policy's anti-natalist scientism grounding represented a break from Maoist politics during the Deng era. But Tyreen White does not. She doesn't believe that the one-child policy necessarily conflicted with Mao's idea of state planning of the population. In the next section, we'll be talking about the actual functioning of the one-child policy, which reveals how in the day-to-day business of limiting family sizes, this campaign to reduce China's population was actually not that different from campaigns during the Mao era. Let's return to the question with which we began this video. Do people have a right to reproduce and to have as many children as they want? In the 1980s, the answer to this question for many Chinese, especially those who lived in the rural areas, was probably yes. But in September 1980, the Central Committee of the CCP issued an open letter to all members of the party and the Youth League, instructing them to begin implementing the one-child policy across the country. In the beginning, all couples, regardless of their background, were only allowed to have one child. The goal was to limit the population to about 1.2 billion by the end of the century, which would involve not only a drastic decrease in the number of births, but considerable sacrifices from rural people especially. In the short span of just 20 years, the Communist Party and local grassroots cadres had to effect a fundamental change in the childbearing habits of hundreds of millions of people. To many of us, achieving such a dramatic change in such a short span of time would be unimaginable. Not the least because it would involve a considerable infringement on the rights of the people. However, Tyreen White attributes the success of the policy to the fact that it followed the same process of spontaneous mass mobilization of the people and the cadres that had characterized campaigns of the Mao era. For this reason, White does not see the one-child policy as necessarily departing from the principles principles of Maoist politics, unlike Greenhalgh. If anything, the CCP was drawing upon the very tactics that Mao had used to ensure that the policy penetrated down to the lowest levels. So let's talk about how the policy was actually enforced among the villages and the rural communes. Getting urban people to limit their family sizes wasn't as big of a task because their birth rates were already declining. Now, when the policy was introduced in 1980, farming in China was organized into communes. Individual households together made up a team, teams made up a brigade, and brigades made up a commune. Population records were maintained at the county level, and these records included information about not just the size and the composition of the population, but how many childbearing age couples there were, how many children they had, whether children born in a certain year were the first, second, third, or higher order birth, etc., etc. So very detailed. And so these records provided vital data that birth planning officials could use to engineer the population. Based on these numbers and the target reduction in birth rates, commune leaders were given birth quotas for each year, which they divided among the brigades based on population. Individual couples within a team had to acquire a birth permit if they wanted to have a child in a given year. Having a child without a permit posed a risk to their future social and economic security, as illegal children could not acquire the household registration that gave them access to housing, employment, and state-sponsored education and healthcare. So male team and brigade leaders did have a role in making sure that people were practicing family planning. However, the most important role was often that of the women's leader, whose duties involved monitoring the bodies and the reproductive status of women within the commune. And once again, we see that women were targeted more than men in efforts to enforce birth policies. Women might be subject to examinations to make sure that they weren't pregnant, and in some places, the women's leaders even recorded and publicly posted information about their menstrual cycles. And so this shows the extent to which the one-child policy was about controlling women's bodies to control the population in the name of the collective good of the nation. I'm just spitting bars without trying. So in theory, party cadres were not permitted to use violent or coercive means to enforce the policy. What they could do was reward couples for limiting births. Single children's parents could receive health subsidies until the child's 14th year. Single children themselves could receive preferential treatment for educational opportunities all the way from primary school to the university level and later in employment. In addition to guaranteed retirement incomes, their parents would also be given priority in housing allocations. In rural areas, on the other hand, one-child households could receive an additional grain allotment, and men and women who underwent birth control procedures like sterilizations, IUD insertions, or abortions were given paid time off to recuperate. So according to the law at least, local cadres were only permitted to punish couples who exceeded birth limits by exacting an excess child fee, which was sometimes as much as 10% of both parents' income until the child was 14 years of age. But in reality, there was considerable force and violence involved in enforcing the birth limits, especially in the countryside. Tyreen White points out that towards the end of 1982, a mobilizational campaign involving over 1 million activists and 100,000 medical workers kicked off with the aim of increasing one-child births and reducing the percentage of third child births by the end of the decade. And according to her, 9.8 million birth control procedures were performed in the first 2 months of 1983, of which 40% or 3.5 million procedures were sterilizations. Yang Kai and Wang Feng point out that in the whole of 1983, a year when 20 million children were born, 14 million abortions took place. And in the couple of years that this campaign lasted, nearly 16 million women underwent tubal ligations compared to 4 million men who underwent vasectomies. The result of all these procedures, as well as educational programs and other forms of persuasion and coercion, was a drastic decline in birth rates rates in 1985. This period of time stands out in the history of the one-child policy, with the sheer numbers of sterilizations and abortions performed hinting at the violence involved in its enforcement. White attributes the excesses of party cadres to the failure of the campaign instructions to warn against using commandism and coercion, instead strongly implying that they would be judged not by their actions but by their results. But the real-life human cost of this were potentially millions of forced abortions, as well as botched sterilization surgeries and IUD insertions that left some women permanently maimed. Now you might be wondering, given the risks involved in having multiple children and the discrimination that illegal children might face later in their lives, why would anyone bother to have more than one child? Well, the need for punishment and coercion itself speaks to the difficulty of drastically changing a childbearing culture in such a short span of time. The low birth rates achieved in Europe, North America, and East Asia, and now even in places like Latin America and India even, are the result of many decades of social change. Among other factors, an increase in the educational and employment opportunities for women especially have contributed to later marriages, fewer births, and a growing cohort of child-free couples and individuals. People's attitudes towards things like marriage and childbearing are influenced by centuries of traditions that you're probably not going to change overnight, no matter how much propaganda you try to spend or how many rewards you offer. Also, traditional Chinese culture values male children more than female children. Sons were considered necessary to carry on the family line, something that daughters couldn't do because they were married out of the family and left home. For rural couples especially, it was important to have at least one son, not just because of the strong ethic of filial piety and traditional Confucian thinking, but because men typically stayed with their natal families and continued to contribute their wealth, their labor, and their resources to their parents' home. For this reason, before the one-child policy, it was common for couples to keep having children until they had at least one son. And the failure to produce a son only brought public humiliation upon a woman, increasing the desperation for a male child. And these attitudes didn't change overnight with the introduction of the one-child policy. Instead, as we will see in a later section about the consequences of the policy, it sometimes resulted in new forms of violence against women and female infants. But there were also economic reasons for people in the countryside to have more children. By 1984, the collectivization of agriculture, which, as you might remember from an earlier section, took place during the Great Leap Forward, had been replaced by a system of household contracting. Under this system, the land was still owned collectively, but it was no longer farmed collectively. Instead, the land was contracted out in pieces to individual households, in return for which these households had to fulfill specific grain quotas. This meant that production was directly tied to the labor capacity of each household, and so having more children meant having more workers. Families might therefore have considered it worth the risk to have multiple children, since the labor that they provided in the future could potentially offset the fines paid upon their birth. So within the first few years of the policy, it became clear that people in the countryside weren't going to take the one-child limit lying down. The violent and coercive means used to enforce the policy provoked backlash from the rural populations, prompting authorities to introduce modifications. Couples were now permitted to have a second child if their first child was a girl, and the birth quota for second children was increased from 5 to 10% and then 10 to 20% in 1985 and 86 respectively. Allowances were also made for urban and rural couples whose first child was disabled. In many ways, this made for a more flexible policy that accommodated the needs of certain groups of people, but when they couldn't get what they wanted, many people resorted to legal and illegal means of manipulating the system to have more children. Susan Greenhalgh talks about how when Song Jian was doing the calculations for China's projected population growth, he treated the people's fertility like a lever that could be pushed up or down by will, from like 3 children to 2 children to 1 child. But the people weren't willing to give up control of their fertility that easily. Instead, they used a number of methods to evade the one-child policy. So method number 1 was to avoid showing your pregnancy by becoming pregnant around August or September, so that once you started showing, it would be winter and you would be packing on more layers, and so nobody would notice your baby bulge. Method number 2 was just to run off either to another village or town. Local cadres didn't have much motivation to run after you, since once you left their jurisdiction, you were no longer their responsibility, but you were also not technically the responsibility of the cadres in the jurisdiction to which you fled, so you could just have your baby in peace. Method number 3 was to claim that your first child didn't really count because they'd either been adopted out or they had a congenital birth defect. I wonder whether that led to any cases of Munchausen by proxy. Method number 4 was really something. Couples who were pregnant with a second child could bribe officials to give them a divorce, since if you were pregnant when you got a divorce, you were allowed to continue the pregnancy. And so once the baby was born, you could just get remarried. Method number 5 was definitely the most painful. Some women straight up just ripped out their IUDs. Some women got doctors to do it, but many just did it on their own, which I do not even know how is that possible. Oh, it sounds so painful. So oftentimes couples were aided in their mission to have more children by local cadres who were willing to collude and to take bribes. While this was partly the result of good old-fashioned corruption, sometimes this willingness to help peasants stemmed from a genuine sympathy for their plight and a recognition of their needs. Local cadres were often people who belonged to the communities for whom they worked. And although, as we've already seen, they were frequently responsible for inflicting violence on average people, in some cases, their loyalties lay more with their community than with the state and its mission. Such cadres were willing, on the one hand, to falsify birth reports and statistics, and on the other hand, to help people have multiple children. Cadres also sold birth permits to people who should not have been having a second or a third child. And it's easy to imagine that such birth permits, which endowed official recognition upon a child and ensured that they were registered, would have been highly coveted items among people looking to grow their families. Paradoxically, birth planning officials and cadres would have actually also benefited from people having excess births. Their work was actually funded in a large part by these excess fees. And so to carry on with the work of making sure that people observe birth limits, the birth planning bureaucracy actually needed people to not observe the limits. So the loyalty of local cadres for their communities demonstrates the difficulty facing the Communist Party in implementing its mission at the grassroots. Based on where you lived and your community identity, there was a certain amount of wiggle room within the policy to allow for multiple births. And in the 1990s, peasant protests against the one-child policy became more frequent and better organized, and often had the support of local cadres. However, their efforts to bring change weren't always successful, and in fact, Tyrone White points to evidence of yet another mobilizational campaign in the early 1990s, when there was a sharp increase in the number of sterilizations performed on women. This might have been a result of the state's efforts to tighten its control over the population in the wake of the Tiananmen Square protests and subsequent massacre. The 1990s also saw the introduction of birth limits for people from ethnic minority backgrounds for the first time. And the maternal infant health care law introduced in 1994 included articles that required doctors to take steps to sterilize or prevent reproduction among couples who had a hereditary condition, whether physical or mental. And this law courted a lot of international controversy at the time because it seemed to Western commentators to be rooted in eugenicist thinking. So even a decade into the policy, the Chinese government was very much interested in engineering its population. But as we have seen in this video, this concern about limiting the quantity and enhancing the quality of the population has a long history in China dating back to the early 20th century. And as we will see in the next section, policies that stemmed from such concerns often had a negative material impact on the bodies and the health of women. In 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party announced the liberation of women from feudalist values that kept them confined to the home and subordinate to men. Women were given the right to divorce and remarry, and practices like child marriages, arranged marriages, and prostitution were officially outlawed. Women were also encouraged to play a greater part in agricultural and industrial production. However, there was considerable pushback to women's participation in the economic sphere, especially at times when employment opportunities were scarce. Even several decades after the CCP came to power, the role of women was primarily conceived to be reproductive. In my opinion, this is indicated by the sheer number of women who were sterilized during the one-child policy era, especially in comparison to men. The thinking seems to have been that if reproduction had to be limited, then it was the bodies of women that had to be controlled. The drastic measures taken to reduce birth rates unfortunately resulted in many botched sterilizations and faulty IUD insertions. In interviews with women who lived through the one-child policy, Sarah Mellers Rodriguez found that many women suffered from pain and heavy periods once they had had an IUD inserted. Working class and rural women had the most to lose if a procedure was unsuccessful, rendering them incapable of doing work both inside and outside of the house. In 1994, in a village in the Yunnan province, several women were forced to undergo sterilization surgeries by the village party secretary. The women reportedly followed around and harassed the party secretary, blaming him for the negative consequences of the surgeries on their bodies, and even asked him to help them perform chores that they were no longer able to do on their own. But while these women were able to get their message across, potentially millions of others suffered in silence. To date, I feel like we lack insight into the psychological impact that birth control campaigns would have had on women. What must it have been like to suddenly and violently lose your fertility in a society that places great value on birthing children, and sons especially? What might have women who were in the final stages of their pregnancy but then forced to have an abortion have gone through emotionally? Without a doubt, one of the most serious consequences of the one-child policy was a severely skewed sex ratio, with about 118 males for every 100 females in the 2000s. This was the result of practices like female abandonment and infanticide. Couples sometimes resorted to illegal means of getting rid of their female children so that they could legally have male children. And this became much easier in the 1980s, when the availability of ultrasound machines in hospitals and clinics allowed parents to determine whether their fetus was a male or female and abort it if the child was a girl. This led China to ban fetal sex determination in 1987, but couples could always bribe doctors and technicians to get the information they wanted. Besides, as Tyreen White points out, local cadres might not have bothered about sex-selective abortions so long as it allowed couples to have sons without exceeding birth limits. And this kind of discrimination led to millions of missing girls. Girls who were not allowed to be born or to live because of the one-child policy. As Yang Kai and Wang Feng point out, the negative impact of this skewed sex ratio is often expressed in terms of the consequences that it has for men. Even today, commentators make such a big deal about the fact that in the next couple of years, there will be anywhere between 20 and 34 million Chinese men who won't have women to marry. Missing women and girls aren't treated as lost lives, they're treated as lost wives. Even in their death, these women continue to be defined by their social roles in relation to men, or what their social roles should have been had they been alive, and not as individuals who are intrinsically worthy. Susan Greenhalgh suggests that the failure to address the risk of violence against women and girls was a result of the urgency with which the one-child policy was implemented in the first place. Such was the sense of alarm about China's growing population in the 1970s, that any negative consequences affecting women's bodies, their health, their lives, were treated as secondary to the mission of reducing the number of births. Greenhalgh also states that the class position of China's population specialists may well have kept them from seeing women's reproductive health and bodily suffering as problems needing attention. Few members of the urban elite had ever witnessed a rural birth planning campaign or understood how the preoccupation with targets could lead local cadres to slight women's bodily health and safety in the rush to reach mandated goals. Women's fertility, particularly rural women's fertility, was viewed as the fundamental cause of China's population, making them the main targets of sterilizations and IUD insertions. Greenhalgh reports that even the small number of people who voiced their opposition to the one-child policy from the very beginning failed to mention issues like female infanticide and skewed sex ratios when critiquing the policy. This shows how the male-centric culture in which both the policy's makers and its critics operated made them not just ignorant but dismissive of its effects on women. But for all its negative consequences, the one-child policy might actually have benefited a small group of women and girls from a specific socioeconomic background. Particularly in urban areas where couples were limited to having just one child regardless of their sex, having just one daughter might have motivated couples to invest the same amount of money and effort into raising her as they would have for a son. Single daughters didn't just enjoy better access to education, they also developed strong emotional bonds with their parents. Sarah Mellers-Rodriguez observed such attitudes in multiple women from Shanghai who had had daughters during the one-child policy era. These women seemed to value their daughters greatly, wanted them to have the best upbringing, and to attend university. They also didn't wish for any additional children or to have a son because of the costs involved with raising multiple children and the interference of child rearing with their professional lives. The attitudes of these women might well have been a result of their urban backgrounds, and the fact that Shanghai was one of the first places where birth planning initiatives and then the one-child policy were introduced. Either way, such women were by no means representative of all women across China, particularly those who lived in interior provinces and belonged to different ethnic groups. An Uyghur woman Mellers-Rodriguez spoke to seemed to be more opposed to the idea of the government interfering with the number of births a couple had. For her, decisions relating to childbearing were a personal matter and should be left to the discretion of the family. The one-child policy affected women from different backgrounds in different ways. I think we're only now beginning to understand the full effects of the one-child policy, not just on China as a whole, but on individual people and families. And we still aren't entirely sure as to how these consequences will shape China in the future. In 2015, the one-child policy came to an end. Over its last 15 years, the regulations of the policy had already been relaxed to a certain extent, first allowing couples where both parents were single children, and then couples where even one parent was a single child to have two children. And in 2016, the one-child policy was officially replaced by the two-child policy. Fears about an aging population and a shrinking labor force encouraged the government to make this alteration. And then in 2021, China officially declared a three-child policy, allowing all couples for the first time in 40 years to have 3 children. Once again, I feel like policymakers are treating the people's fertility like a lever. First, it was in first gear, then they're putting it into the second gear, now they're shifting to third gear. Yes, I know how to drive stick. A three-child policy is not quite the same as a one-child policy, in the sense that couples aren't being forced to have 3 kids in the way that they were once forced to have 1 kid. It's just that they won't be penalized if they have a third baby. However, it remains to be seen whether the state will take steps like restricting access to abortion, which is generally quite easily available in China, in an effort to push up birth rates. The three-child policy and the encouragement to couples to have more children once again disregards the social and the economic factors that have now led to a certain expectation of childbearing and child-rearing among younger generations. Many young people today simply don't have the time or the financial resources to be raising 3 kids. And given that many childbearing age people today were themselves products of the one-child policy, I do find it likely that they too will have smaller families. I hope this video has given you some sense of the conflicts that tend to arise when states try to determine how many children a couple should be having. And in the next video, we will also be exploring how, in the supposedly liberal context of the United States, the government was nevertheless interested in making sure that people abide by certain reproductive values. The fight for abortion was a long and hard one, and with many women standing at risk of losing access to abortion with the overturn of Roe v. Wade in recent years, there is a possibility that we will begin to witness an increase in the state's intervention in people's reproductive lives, which will give rise to many similar ethical dilemmas that arose in China in the 1980s and 1990s. So if you don't want to miss the next video about America, where we're going to be talking about many of the same conflicts but in a very different context, then don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.